One man spent years missing out on opportunities because he cared too much about what other people thought of him. He stayed quiet when he wanted to speak up, held back when he wanted to take action, and slowly watched life pass him by. Then he discovered something called the spotlight effect, and it changed everything. But before we get started, tell me who you are and what time it is where you're watching this video from. Leave a comment below. Alex was 29 years old and worked as a project coordinator for a tech company in Chicago. If you met him in real life, there's a good chance you wouldn't remember anything particularly remarkable about him. He wasn't the loudest person in the room. He wasn't the most confident either. He was the kind of guy who always met deadlines, treated people well, and rarely caused any trouble. To his coworkers, Alex was reliable. To his friends, he was easy to be around. To himself, he was simply careful. At least, that's what he always believed. He was careful before sharing an opinion. Careful before trying something new. Careful before drawing attention to himself. For years, he saw that as a good thing, until he started realizing how much that carefulness was actually costing him. One Monday morning, Alex was sitting in a meeting with his team when his manager asked a question. It was a problem they had been discussing for weeks without finding a good solution. The moment he heard the question, an idea came to him. The truth was, he had already been thinking about it. He knew it could work. He had even started putting together how he would explain it in his head. But then he looked around the room. Everyone was silent, waiting for someone else to speak first. Alex felt his heart beat a little faster. What if this idea wasn't as good as he thought? What if nobody agreed? What if he had missed something obvious that everyone else could see? He decided to wait a few more seconds. Just a few. Just to be sure. Just to think it through one more time. Just to avoid making a mistake. But, while he was still having that argument with himself, a coworker sitting across the table finally spoke up. The coworker shared almost the exact same idea Alex had been thinking about. The manager immediately nodded. A few other people jumped in with their thoughts. The discussion quickly came to life. Alex sat there listening. And the more he listened, the more he realized it was exactly what he had wanted to say. What bothered him wasn't that someone else got the credit. What bothered him was the familiar feeling creeping back once again. The feeling of watching an opportunity slip away right in front of him. When the meeting ended, everyone stood up and went back to work. Nobody knew what had just happened inside Alex's head. Nobody knew what he had wanted to say. Nobody knew he had changed his mind at the very last second. And that was the strange part. Alex always felt like people were paying attention to him. On the drive home, he tried to forget about the whole thing. After all, it was just a meeting. Nobody would remember it tomorrow. But deep down, he knew the meeting wasn't the real problem. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. And it definitely wasn't the only place it happened. A few weeks later, Alex found himself back at his favorite bookstore on a Saturday afternoon. He usually spent a few hours there reading and drinking coffee before heading home. Just like many times before, he spotted the familiar girl in the fiction section again. The first time he saw her, he didn't think much of it. The second time wasn't any different. But before long, those chance encounters started happening more often. Little by little, she became a familiar part of his weekends. Sometimes they would find themselves standing in front of the same bookshelf for a few minutes. In fact, he had imagined that first conversation in his head over and over again. Maybe he would ask what she was reading. Maybe he would ask if she came here often. It didn't have to be clever. It didn't have to be interesting. It just had to start. But every time he was about to walk over, another conversation would begin inside his head. Maybe she wanted to be alone. Maybe he'd be bothering her. Maybe she'd think he was weird. Maybe he'd make things awkward. The more he thought about it, the harder it became to take that first step. One day, Alex walked into the bookstore and saw her sitting in the cafe area. But this time, she wasn't alone. There was another man sitting across from her. The two of them were laughing about something. It looked natural, comfortable. effortless. Alex stood there for a few seconds before turning away. What bothered him wasn't that she was talking to someone else. What bothered him was that the other guy didn't seem particularly special. He had simply done the one thing Alex hadn't been able to do all this time. He walked up and started a conversation. That night, Alex lay on his couch thinking about the meeting. Then he thought about the girl from the bookstore. Completely different situations. Yet somehow they left him with exactly the same feeling. And for the first time, Alex seriously asked himself a question. Was he missing out on more than he realized? The answer to that question showed up when a friend named Ryan invited Alex to a networking event for people working in tech. Normally, Alex would have turned it down immediately. He hated places like that. Too many strangers. Too many conversations. Too many opportunities to make himself look foolish. But this time, Ryan wouldn't let it go. "You should come," Ryan said. "You never know who you might meet." Alex laughed. That was exactly what he didn't want. The problem was that he never knew what to say in situations like that. Everyone else always seemed more natural, more confident, and more interesting. In Alex's mind, networking events were filled with people who knew exactly what they were doing, and he was the only one who didn't belong there. Eventually, after enough convincing, he agreed to go. The moment he walked into the venue, he wanted to leave. People stood in small groups talking, laughing, and exchanging business cards. From a distance, it all looked easy. But to Alex, every group felt like a door he didn't know how to walk through. Ryan quickly struck up conversations with a few people and blended right in. Alex stood near the drink table, holding a cup of coffee and pretending to be busy looking around the room. A little while later, he noticed a group of 3 people talking about a project he was genuinely interested in. He knew quite a bit about the topic. He even had a few ideas he wanted to share. This was the opportunity. All he had to do was walk over. All he had to do was say one sentence. Any sentence. But then the familiar voice returned. What if they don't want me joining the conversation? What if I'm interrupting? What if I say something stupid? Alex stayed exactly where he was. He watched the conversation unfold. Then he watched it end. The group eventually split up and walked away, and the opportunity disappeared with them. On the drive home, Ryan talked about meeting a product director from a large company. They exchanged contact information and planned to talk again the following week. Ryan seemed excited. Alex just nodded. But inside, that familiar feeling showed up once again. It wasn't jealousy. It was regret. Once again, he had been in the right place at the right time, yet somehow ended up standing on the sidelines. What bothered him most was that he knew why. Nobody stopped him. Nobody told him he couldn't join. Nobody rejected him. He took himself out of the game before the game had even begun. And if that was true, then the next question became a lot more uncomfortable. How long had he been letting this fear run his life? That question stayed with Alex longer than he expected. At first, he tried to ignore it. He still went to work, still met up with friends, still lived the same familiar life. But now, whenever he caught himself backing away from an opportunity, he couldn't brush it off the way he used to. Something had changed. It was like discovering a strange noise somewhere in your house. Before you notice it, life feels completely normal. But once you've heard it, you can't pretend it isn't there. His fear of being judged started to feel the same way. Alex began seeing it everywhere. One morning, he was sitting in a meeting when a coworker accidentally read the wrong number from a report. The room went quiet for a few seconds. The coworker immediately corrected himself. The meeting continued. Nobody laughed. Nobody brought it up again. Nobody cared. But Alex knew that if it had happened to him, he would have thought about it for the rest of the week. On his way home that day, he tried to remember what number the coworker had gotten wrong. He couldn't remember. And that felt strange. If even he couldn't remember the mistake, why did he always believe everyone else would remember his? A few days later, he was standing in line for coffee when the man in front of him accidentally dropped his drink, splashed onto the floor, and onto his shoes. The man looked embarrassed. Alex glanced around. A few people helped clean it up. A couple of people smiled. Less than a minute later, everyone went back to what they were doing. Life carried on, as if nothing had happened. On his way to work, Alex realized he had already forgotten what the man looked like. He couldn't even remember what he was wearing. But what if that had been him? He knew exactly what would have happened inside his head. He would have replayed the moment for the rest of the day. Maybe for the rest of the week. Maybe even longer. The strange thing was that other people didn't seem to do that. One evening, Alex was sitting on the couch with his laptop when he started searching questions he had never really thought about before. Why are people so afraid of being judged? Why do we always think other people are paying attention to us? Why do embarrassing moments feel so much bigger than they really are? He read article after article, watched video after video, and eventually, he came across a term he had never heard before: the spotlight effect. The moment he started reading about it, Alex felt like someone was describing his life. The idea was simple. People tend to believe they're being noticed far more than they actually are. We walk into a room and assume everyone is looking at us. We make a small mistake and think everyone will remember it. We say something awkward and imagine people talking about it afterward. But reality is different. People around us are usually too busy thinking about themselves. They're worried about how they look, the mistakes they've made, and what other people think about them, just like we are. Alex sat there for a long time after reading it. Not because the idea was complicated, but because it was so simple. Almost too simple. If this was true, if most people really weren't paying nearly as much attention to him as he thought, then what did that mean? It meant that many of the decisions he'd made in his life were based on a false assumption. It meant that many of the opportunities he thought he'd lost were never actually taken away from him. Maybe he had given them up himself. And that was the thought that bothered him the most. Because if other people were the problem, there was nothing he could do about it. But if the problem was the way he saw the world, then maybe things could change. That question stayed in Alex's mind for days. Did he have the courage to find out if it was true? Him wanted to believe the spotlight effect was real. Another part thought maybe it was just another interesting idea from the internet. Maybe it worked for other people. Maybe it didn't apply to him. Fear always has a way of sounding reasonable. It doesn't shout. It doesn't make demands. It just whispers. Better be careful. Do anything stupid. Don't draw too much attention to yourself. Alex had been listening to that voice for most of his life. But for the first time, he decided not to listen to it right away. An opportunity came during another meeting. The manager asked a question, and Alex knew the answer. He also knew exactly what was about to happen. The familiar voice showed up again. What if I'm wrong? What if nobody agrees? What if this sounds stupid? Alex didn't try to push those thoughts away. He simply let them be. And then he spoke anyway. His idea didn't amaze the room. Nobody stood up and applauded. Nobody said it was the best idea they'd ever heard. Some people agreed. Some people didn't. The discussion continued. Then the meeting ended. That was it. His way back to his desk, Alex realized something that was almost funny. In his head, that moment had felt like jumping out of an airplane. In real life, it felt like a completely normal conversation. But what surprised him even more was how he felt afterward. For the first time in a very long time, he felt like he had won a small battle. Not against other people, against himself. During lunch, Alex accidentally told a story that wasn't very interesting. The moment he finished, he felt embarrassed. In his mind, everyone had probably noticed how bad it was. He spent the entire afternoon thinking about it. The next day, he asked one of his coworkers about the conversation. Yesterday, Alex nodded. The coworker thought for a few seconds. Honestly, I don't even remember what we were talking about. Alex laughed. Not because the answer was funny, but because it confirmed something he was slowly beginning to understand. Most people don't spend nearly as much time thinking about you as you think they do. They're busy thinking about themselves, just like he used to. A few days later, Alex found himself thinking about the girl from the bookstore again. The first time, he didn't feel regret, because he finally understood what had really hurt all those months ago. It wasn't that he had missed out on a person. It was that he had missed out on the chance to become the person he wanted to be. The kind of person who steps forward. The kind of person who takes a chance. The kind of person who's willing to risk rejection. For years, Alex believed confidence was something you needed before you took action. Now he was starting to realize the opposite was true. Confidence usually comes after action, not before it. You don't become brave and then do something difficult. You do the difficult thing first. Then, little by little, you become braver because of it. For years, every time Alex walked into a room, it felt like a spotlight was shining directly on him. Everyone was watching. Everyone was judging. Everyone was paying attention. Everyone would remember every mistake he made. Now he knew that wasn't true. Not because people were kinder than he thought, but because they were busier than he thought. They were worried about how they looked, the mistakes they had made, the conversations they kept replaying in their heads, and the problems in their own lives, just like he used to be. Alex had spent years performing for an imaginary audience. An audience that barely existed. When he finally realized that, he felt a strange kind of freedom. Not the kind that makes all your fears disappear. The kind that stops you from asking everyone else's permission to be yourself. In the end, the spotlight effect didn't change Alex's life because it made him perfect. It changed his life because, for the first time, he understood that most of the limits in his life had never been created by other people. They were created by the stories he kept telling himself. Stories that said everyone was watching. Everyone was judging. Everyone was waiting for him to make a mistake, when the truth was much simpler. Most people are far too busy living their own lives to spend much time thinking about yours. And that's why the day you stop caring what other people think isn't the day you become fearless. It's the day you realize fear no longer deserves the right to make decisions for you. Because life doesn't change when fear disappears. Life changes when you keep moving forward, even while fear is still there. And sometimes, the difference between the life you're living and the life you truly want is nothing more than a few seconds of courage. If you stop worrying about what other people think today, what's the first thing you'd do? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next story.